In the winter of 1863, children began disappearing from the streets of Missouri's war-torn towns. They weren't taken by Confederate raiders or Union soldiers. They were lured by promises of warm beds and hot meals to a boarding house where childhood ended, and something far more sinister began. The advertisement appeared in the Missouri Republican on November 15, 1863, nestled between notices of missing soldiers and land auctions. Respectable boarding house seeks orphaned children. Comfortable accommodations, Christian education, and honest work provided. Apply to Mrs. Cordelia Blackwood, 1247 Elm Street. In a state ravaged by civil war, where thousands of children wandered homeless after their fathers marched away and never returned, such an offer seemed like divine providence. Mrs. Cordelia Blackwood cut an imposing figure at 53, her black mourning dress perpetually crisp despite the November mud that clung to everything else in the river town of Hermann, Missouri. She moved through the streets with purpose, her pale gray eyes scanning doorways and alleys where children huddled for warmth. Local residents recognized her immediately, the widow who'd lost her husband to dysentery early in the war, left with only her sprawling 3-story boarding house and, they whispered, mounting debts. What they didn't know was that Mrs. Blackwood had discovered something far more valuable than room rentals. The state's new child labor laws contained a profitable loophole. Orphaned children, classified as wards of charitable institutions, could be contracted out for work with minimal oversight. The war had created a desperate shortage of factory hands, farm workers, and domestic servants. Mill owners and factory supervisors asked few questions about the ages or working conditions of children, especially when Mrs. Blackwood's rates were so reasonable. The boarding house itself stood like a monument to faded prosperity on Herman's main thoroughfare. 3 stories of weathered clapboard rose above a wraparound porch that creaked ominously in the Missouri wind. Neighbors later recalled how the windows always seemed too dark, even on sunny days, as if heavy curtains perpetually blocked the light. The front parlor, where Mrs. Blackwood interviewed prospective residents, was decorated with religious paintings and samplers proclaiming virtues like "Suffer the little children" and "Idle hands are the devil's workshop." By December 1863, 17 children between the ages of 7 and 14 had taken residence at 1247 Elm Street. They came from across central Missouri. War orphans, foundlings, children whose mothers had died of disease or starvation while their fathers fought in distant battles. Each arrived carrying their few possessions in flour sacks or bundled in torn blankets, their hollow eyes reflecting months or years of uncertainty. Mrs. Blackwood greeted each new arrival with the same speech about Christian charity and honest labor-building character. She served them their first hot meal in months, showed them to dormitory-style rooms on the 2nd floor, and explained the house rules. What she didn't explain was that they had just become commodities in Missouri's most profitable and horrifying enterprise. Tell me in the comments, if you were a desperate child in 1863, would promises of food and shelter have been enough to trust a stranger? The morning routine at Mrs. Blackwood's boarding house began before dawn with the clanging of a dinner bell. Children stumbled from their narrow beds, 22 souls crowded into 4 cramped rooms on the 2nd floor. The youngest, 7-year-old Timothy Morse, whose parents had died of cholera outside Jefferson City, often woke with tears frozen to his cheeks from the Missouri cold that seeped through the thin walls. Mrs. Blackwood had perfected what she called the contract system, a web of agreements that transformed homeless children into indentured servants. Local business owners discovered they could secure workers for a fraction of normal wages by contracting with the boarding house. Mill supervisor Heinrich Gottfried paid Mrs. Blackwood $12 monthly for 3 boys to work 14-hour shifts at his textile operation. The children themselves saw none of this money. It went toward their room and board, which Mrs. Blackwood calculated with creative accounting that ensured they remained perpetually in debt. The contracts were masterfully constructed legal documents that exploited Missouri's wartime labor shortage. Children were bound to work until age 18, with their wages automatically deducted for housing, food, clothing, and moral education. Any attempt to leave resulted in additional debt for breach of contract and cost of replacement training. Local magistrate Judge Cornelius Hartwell, who approved these arrangements, later claimed he thought he was helping establish apprenticeships that would give orphans valuable trades. What made the system particularly sinister was its appearance of legitimacy. Mrs. Blackwood maintained meticulous records, filed proper paperwork with county officials, and even hosted occasional inspections by visiting clergy. Reverend Marcus Fitzhugh of Herman's Methodist congregation praised her Christian enterprise in a December 1863 sermon, noting how she had transformed vagrant children into productive members of society. The children's daily schedule was rigid and unforgiving. They woke at 4:30 a.m., consumed watery porridge and day-old bread, then walked through pre-dawn darkness to their assigned workplaces. At Gottfried's Mill, boys operated dangerous machinery designed for adult hands. Girls were sent to work as domestic servants in wealthy households where they scrubbed floors, tended fires, and endured the temperamental moods of employers who viewed them as slightly more valuable than livestock. Evenings brought no respite. Children returned to the boarding house exhausted, their small hands bleeding from factory work or raw from lye soap used in endless laundering. Mrs. Blackwood required them to attend moral instruction sessions where she read from religious texts about the virtues of hard work and obedience. Any complaint or sign of rebellion resulted in reduced food rations or confinement to the basement. By January 1864, neighbors began noticing something troubling about the children who lived at 1247 Elm Street. They moved differently, heads down, shoulders hunched, as if carrying invisible weights. Would you have recognized the signs of exploitation, or would the promise of helping vagrant children have blinded you to the truth? State Inspector William Carruthers arrived at 1247 Elm Street on a bitter February morning in 1864, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he approached the boarding house's front porch. The inspection had been prompted by an anonymous letter to the Missouri Bureau of Child Welfare, a hastily scrawled note claiming that children at Mrs. Blackwood's establishment were being worked like slaves and treated worse than animals. The letter was unsigned, but the desperation in its cramped handwriting suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the house's operations. Mrs. Blackwood had received advance notice of the inspection, as was customary for reputable charitable institutions. She spent the preceding week transforming 1247 Elm Street into a theatrical performance. The children's dormitory rooms, normally packed with thin mattresses on bare floors, were reconfigured with proper beds spaced at decent intervals. Clean linens appeared, along with wash basins and mirrors that hadn't been seen since the children's arrival. The basement where punishment and moral correction typically occurred was locked and declared under renovation. Most cunningly, Mrs. Blackwood temporarily relocated her most visibly mistreated children to work assignments in distant towns. 12-year-old Sarah Whitmore, whose fingers had been mangled in mill machinery, was sent to a farm outside Columbia. Brothers Jake and Samuel Turner, bearing obvious signs of malnutrition and overwork, were dispatched to a tannery in St. Charles. Only the healthiest, most articulate children remained to greet Inspector Carruthers. The performance was masterful. When Carruthers interviewed 10-year-old Emma Caldwell, she recited a carefully rehearsed script about Mrs. Blackwood's Christian kindness and how grateful she was for learning honest work. The inspector noted her clean dress and rosy cheeks, not realizing that both were temporary props applied that morning. Emma had been coached for days, with Mrs. Blackwood making clear that any deviation from the approved responses would result in severe consequences for all the children. The tour proceeded through rooms that bore no resemblance to the boarding house's normal conditions. Carruthers observed children engaged in educational activities, reading primers and practicing penmanship, rather than the typical scene of exhausted souls collapsing after 14-hour workdays. The dining room displayed a feast that represented more food than the children usually saw in a week. Mrs. Blackwood explained their philosophy of character building through purposeful labor, emphasizing how they prepared orphans for productive lives in Christian society. Inspector Carruthers departed with glowing praise for Mrs. Blackwood's operation. His official report, filed with the state on February 28, 1864, commended the boarding house as a model institution that successfully combines charitable care with practical education. He recommended that other counties adopt similar programs for their orphaned populations. Within hours of his departure, the theatric zone, all props vanished. Beds returned to the storage room, extra food disappeared, and the relocated children began their long journey back to Herman. If you were one of those children watching this elaborate deception unfold, how would you have found the courage to reveal the truth? Behind the facade of Christian charity, Mrs. Blackwood operated an underground network that extended far beyond Herman's city limits. Her boarding house was merely the visible tip of a child trafficking operation that stretched across war-torn Missouri, exploiting the chaos of civil conflict to harvest vulnerable children for profit. Local scouts, often railroad workers, traveling merchants, and even clergy, received bounties for identifying orphaned children in distant towns and villages. Brother Thomas Kellerman, a traveling preacher who worked the river towns along the Missouri, became one of Mrs. Blackwood's most effective recruiters. His sermons about Christian duty to orphaned lambs served as cover for identifying children whose parents had died or disappeared. He carried official-looking documents proclaiming his authority to relocate displaced minors to approved charitable institutions. Town leaders, overwhelmed by their own wartime struggles, were often grateful when Brother Kellerman volunteered to remove the burden of caring for homeless children. The recruitment process was coldly systematic. Scouts maintained detailed records of each child's age, physical condition, and potential work capacity. Strong boys were earmarked for factory labor or farm work. Nimble-fingered girls were designated for textile mills or domestic service. Children with obvious disabilities or chronic illnesses were simply not recruited. Mrs. Blackwood's operation had no use for those who couldn't generate immediate profit. Transportation of children followed established underground railroad routes, but in reverse. Where abolitionists had once smuggled enslaved people toward freedom, Mrs. Blackwood's network moved children toward exploitation. Hidden compartments in wagons, coded signals between stations, and safe houses where children could be held temporarily. All the infrastructure of clandestine movement was repurposed for this darker trade. Local authorities either didn't know or deliberately ignored what was happening. Sheriff Eugene Patterson of Gasconade County later testified that he thought Brother Kellerman and similar figures were performing charitable work by removing orphaned children from communities that couldn't support them. The distinction between legitimate orphanages and trafficking operations was deliberately blurred by Mrs. Blackwood's careful documentation and official-appearing paperwork. By spring 1864, the network had expanded to include connections in Kansas City, St. Louis, and even across the state line into Illinois. Mrs. Blackwood maintained correspondence with similar operations in other states, sharing information about market demands for child workers. A letter discovered years later revealed her writing to a colleague in Chicago. The mill owners here are requesting younger children, as their small hands are better suited to operating the new textile machinery. Can you supply 8 to 10 children between ages 7 and 10 by month's end? The children themselves became aware that their situation at 1247 Elm Street was part of something larger and more sinister than they had initially understood. Whispered conversations in the dormitory rooms revealed that many had traveled impossible distances to reach Herman, following routes that made no sense for legitimate child placement. Do you think communities genuinely couldn't recognize child trafficking when they saw it, or were they willfully blind to practices that solved their own problems? Beneath the main floor of 1247 Elm Street lay a basement that served as the dark heart of Mrs. Blackwood's operation. What began as a simple storage cellar had been converted into a chamber of discipline and terror, where children learned the consequences of questioning their circumstances or failing to meet work quotas. The basement's stone walls, built when the house was constructed in 1847, seemed to absorb sound, muffling the cries and pleas that echoed within. Mrs. Blackwood called it the reflection room, a euphemism that barely concealed its true purpose. Children who arrived late from work assignments, complained about conditions, or showed signs of resistance found themselves descending the narrow wooden stairs into a space that smelled of dampness, fear, and despair. The basement's single window had been bricked over, leaving only the flickering light of oil lamps to illuminate its contents. The punishment system was methodical and psychologically devastating. Minor infractions resulted in reduced food rations and solitary confinement in wooden crates barely large enough for a child to sit upright. More serious offenses, such as attempting to communicate with outsiders about conditions in the boarding house, brought physical punishment that left children unable to work for days. Mrs. Blackwood justified these measures as moral correction, claiming that harsh discipline was necessary to prepare orphaned children for the realities of adult life. 14-year-old Marcus Brennan, who had dared to complain to his mill supervisor about the long hours and dangerous working conditions, spent 3 days chained to the basement wall with only bread crusts and water. When he emerged, other children barely recognized the hollow-eyed, trembling boy who had once been their most spirited companion. Marcus never spoke of what happened during those 72 hours, but his broken silence sent a clear message to every child in the house. Resistance was futile. The basement also served as Mrs. Blackwood's record-keeping center, where she maintained detailed files on each child's earning potential, work assignments, and behavioral assessments. Ledgers documented every penny of their supposed debt to the boarding house, calculated with creative accounting that ensured no child could ever work their way to freedom. The records revealed the cold, mathematical precision with which Mrs. Blackwood viewed her charges. Not as human beings deserving care and protection, but as assets to be maximized for profit. Perhaps most disturbing were the punishment devices that Mrs. Blackwood had acquired or constructed specifically for disciplining children. Wooden restraints designed for small wrists and ankles, iron chains that could secure a child in position for hours or days, and crude implements that left marks carefully positioned where they wouldn't be visible to outside observers. She had studied the methods used in adult prisons and workhouses, adapting them for use on children whose only crime was being born into poverty and misfortune. The basement's existence was known to every child in the boarding house, but never discussed openly. Its presence hung over daily life like a storm cloud, influencing every decision and suppressing any thoughts of rebellion or escape. Imagine knowing that beneath your feet lay a chamber of horrors designed specifically to break your spirit. Would you have found the courage to resist, or would fear have made you compliant? At Heinrich Gottfried's textile mill on the outskirts of Hermann, the workday began at 5 o'clock a.m. sharp with the screaming whistle that could be heard across town. By the time the sun crested the Missouri River bluffs, 16 children from Mrs. Blackwood's boarding house were already at their stations, operating machinery designed for adult hands in conditions that would have shocked even hardened factory workers. The mill's limestone walls trapped heat in summer and offered no protection from bitter winter winds, creating a workplace that alternated between suffocating and freezing, depending on the season. Young Timothy Morse, still only 7 years old, worked the cotton-picking machines that required him to crawl beneath moving belts and rotating gears to clear jams and retrieve dropped materials. His small size, which Mrs. Blackwood had marketed as an advantage to mill supervisor Gottfried, made him valuable for accessing tight spaces that adult workers couldn't reach, but it also made him uniquely vulnerable to the crushing, cutting, and entangling dangers that lurked in every corner of the facility. The children worked 14-hour shifts with only 2 brief breaks, 15 minutes at noon for a meal of cornbread and water, and 10 minutes in the evening for what Gottfried generously called fresh air time. During these precious moments, they huddled together outside the mill's main entrance, sharing whispered conversations about families they barely remembered and dreams of escape that seemed increasingly impossible. Accidents were frequent and devastating. 12-year-old Rebecca Walsh lost 2 fingers when her hand was caught in a spinning Jenny's mechanism during her 3rd week at the mill. Gottfried's response was to dock her pay for the time she spent recovering and to reassign her to an even more dangerous position, operating the fabric-cutting machinery. Mrs. Blackwood, when informed of the incident, expressed concern only about whether Rebecca would still be able to perform her assigned duties. The children's bodies began showing the effects of industrial labor within weeks of their arrival. Their growth was stunted by malnutrition and the physical demands of factory work. Their lungs developed persistent coughs from cotton fibers and chemical fumes that filled the mill's air. Their hands became permanently stained and scarred from contact with dyes and machinery. Most tragically, their eyes, which should have sparkled with childhood curiosity and wonder, grew dull with exhaustion and resignation. Gottfried maintained the pretense that his young workers were apprentices learning valuable trades, but his private correspondence revealed a different perspective. In a letter to a business associate in St. Louis, he wrote, "The children from Mrs. Blackwood's establishment work twice as hard as adult laborers and accept half the wages. They don't organize unions, don't demand better conditions, and don't question overtime requirements. From a business standpoint, they represent ideal workers." The other mill employees, adult men and women who had worked in factories before the war, watched the children suffering with a mixture of pity and helplessness. Some tried to offer small kindnesses, sharing portions of their own food, teaching safer ways to operate dangerous machinery, or simply providing words of encouragement during the longest days. But speaking out against the treatment of Mrs. Blackwood's children meant risking their own jobs in an economy where employment was scarce and desperation ran high. If you were an adult worker watching children suffer in dangerous conditions, would you have risked your own livelihood to speak out, or would economic necessity have forced you into complicity? While boys labored in mills and factories, girls from Mrs. Blackwood's boarding house faced a different but equally exploitative fate as domestic servants in Herman's wealthier households. These positions, marketed by Mrs. Blackwood as opportunities to learn proper household management, placed children as young as 8 years old in homes where they worked from dawn until well past midnight, performing every menial task their employers could devise. 11-year-old Catherine Mills found herself assigned to the Pemberton Mansion on Highland Avenue, a sprawling 3-story home that housed banker Jeremiah Pemberton, his wife Constance, their 4 adult children, and visiting relatives who came and went throughout the year. Catherine's duties included scrubbing floors, tending multiple fireplaces, preparing meals, washing and mending clothes, emptying chamber pots, and serving as a personal attendant to Mrs. Pemberton, whose chronic illnesses required constant care. The work was relentless and physically demanding. Catherine rose at 4:30 a.m. to light fires throughout the house before the family woke, ensuring every room was warm and comfortable for their morning routines. She prepared breakfast, served the family, cleaned up after them, then began a cycle of household chores that continued until the last family member retired for the evening. Only then could she retreat to a cramped space in the attic that served as her sleeping quarters. A room so small she could barely stand upright and so poorly insulated that water froze in her wash basin during winter months. Mrs. Pemberton took particular pleasure in finding fault with Catherine's work, using minor imperfections as justification for withholding meals or extending work hours as punishment. A spot missed while dusting, a wrinkle in a tablecloth, or a moment's hesitation when called, all became reasons for verbal abuse and additional chores. When Catherine's hands became raw and bleeding from constant exposure to lye soap and harsh cleaning chemicals, Mrs. Pemberton complained about unsightly servants and demanded that Catherine wear gloves to hide the damage. The isolation was perhaps worse than the physical demands. Unlike children working in mills who could whisper encouragement to each other, domestic servants labored alone in their assigned households with no contact with other children from the boarding house. Catherine went weeks without speaking to anyone her own age, existing in a world of adult demands and expectations that no child should be expected to meet. Social events at wealthy households revealed the grotesque nature of the domestic servant system. When the Pembertons hosted dinner parties or holiday celebrations, Catherine and other child servants were displayed like exotic curiosities. Guests often remarked on how well-trained and obedient the young servants appeared, praising Mrs. Blackwood's excellent program for civilizing vagrant children. The adults saw competent service. They missed the hollow exhaustion in young eyes and the trembling hands that spoke of overwork and maltreatment. Some households treated their child servants with slightly more humanity than others, but even the kindest employers maintained the fundamental relationship of exploitation. They provided adequate food and shelter not out of compassion, but because healthy servants worked more efficiently than malnourished ones. What struck contemporary observers was how quickly these children learned to make themselves invisible, moving through elaborate households like ghosts, anticipating needs before they were voiced, and disappearing the moment their services weren't required. Do you think wealthy families genuinely believed they were helping orphaned children by employing them as servants, or did they knowingly exploit vulnerable children for their own convenience? On a moonless night in April 1864, 3 children from Mrs. Blackwood's boarding house attempted what none had dared before: escape. 15-year-old James Hartford, 13-year-old Mary O'Brien, and 10-year-old Peter Kowalski had spent weeks planning their flight from 1247 Elm Street, studying the patterns of Mrs. Blackwood's nightly inspections and identifying the 1 hour between midnight and dawn when the house lay truly unguarded. James had been at the boarding house longest, arriving in November 1863 after his parents died in a cholera outbreak near Kansas City. His months of factory work had left him skeletal and exhausted, but also burning with a rage that sustained him through 14-hour shifts and basement punishments. Mary, originally from a farm outside Columbia, had watched her younger brother Thomas waste away under the boarding house's brutal conditions until he died of pneumonia the previous February. Peter, the youngest of the 3 conspirators, possessed a desperate courage born from months of abuse that would have broken many adult prisoners. Their plan was simple: wait until Mrs. Blackwood completed her 1 a.m. security rounds, then slip from their dormitory room through a second-floor window onto the porch roof, climb down the oak tree that grew near the house's eastern wall, and disappear into the Missouri countryside before dawn. They had stolen small portions of bread over several days, creating a meager food supply that might sustain them for the 3-day walk to Jefferson City, where James believed they could find help from Union Army authorities. The escape began flawlessly. Mrs. Blackwood's heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway at precisely 1 a.m., followed by the familiar sound of her bedroom door closing and the creaking of her bed frame. 20 minutes later, the 3 children eased open their window and began their descent. James went first, testing each foothold on the porch roof and identifying the safest route to the oak tree. Mary followed, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would wake the entire household. Peter came last, his small hands shaking as he gripped the window frame. They had made it to the ground and were creeping across Mrs. Blackwood's backyard when disaster struck. A loose board in the property's fence caught Peter's foot, sending him sprawling with a crash that seemed to echo across the sleeping town. Dogs began barking, windows lit up in neighboring houses. Within minutes, Mrs. Blackwood's voice was shouting from her bedroom window, and the sound of boots hitting the front porch stairs announced that their brief taste of freedom was over. The recapture was swift and merciless, as Mrs. Blackwood had awakened brother Thomas Kellerman and 2 local men who served as informal security for her operation. The children were dragged back to 1247 Elm Street within an hour of their escape attempt, their faces already bearing the marks of violence that would grow worse in the basement punishment sessions that followed. James Hartford was never seen alive again after that night. The official explanation was that he had taken ill and been transferred to medical care in St. Louis, but the other children knew better. If you had been planning an escape from such horrific conditions, what would you have done differently, and do you think you would have had the courage to try? The first death at 1247 Elm Street was attributed to natural causes. 8-year-old Thomas O'Brien, Mary's younger brother, succumbed to pneumonia on February 14, 1864, after weeks of deteriorating health that Mrs. Blackwood claimed was due to a weak constitution rather than malnutrition and overwork. Dr. Ezekiel Morrison, Herman's only physician, signed the death certificate without conducting a thorough examination, noting simply that the child had failed to thrive in spite of adequate care and Christian guidance. But Thomas's death established a disturbing pattern that would repeat with increasing frequency throughout 1864. Children who became too sick to work, who showed signs of rebellion, or who simply knew too much about Mrs. Blackwood's operation began disappearing from the boarding house. Sometimes their deaths were announced and explained. Other times they simply vanished with stories about being transferred to other institutions or reunited with distant relatives. James Hartford's disappearance following the failed escape attempt was the most obvious case of what was actually happening. Mrs. Blackwood announced that he had taken seriously ill from exposure during his reckless nighttime adventure and required specialized medical treatment unavailable in Herman. She produced official-looking transfer papers indicating that James had been served and moved to a hospital in St. Louis for intensive care and moral rehabilitation. No hospital in St. Louis had any record of James Hartford's admission. When Mary O'Brien worked up the courage to ask Mrs. Blackwood for James's exact location so she could pray for his recovery, she was told that such information was confidential medical business and that her inappropriate curiosity suggested she needed additional moral instruction. Mary spent the next 3 days in the basement punishment room, emerging with the understanding that questions about missing children were dangerous. The pattern became clear to the surviving children. Those who posed threats to Mrs. Blackwood's operation simply stopped existing. 12-year-old Samuel Worth, who had tried to send a letter to his aunt in Kansas City describing conditions at the boarding house, was announced dead from sudden fever within a week of his letter being intercepted. 14-year-old Emma Caldwell, who had begun showing signs of pregnancy after months of abuse, a scandal that could have exposed the boarding house to unwanted scrutiny, died from complications of a female nature that Dr. Morrison declined to examine closely. The disposal of bodies was handled with the same systematic efficiency that characterized all of Mrs. Blackwood's operations. Local undertaker Silas Craddock, whose business had struggled during the war years, found steady income in providing charitable burial services for children from the boarding house. The graves, located in an unmarked section of Herman Cemetery, were shallow and unadorned, containing bodies that bore evidence of maltreatment that no one was willing to acknowledge. By the summer of 1864, 17 children had died or disappeared from 1247 Elm Street since the boarding house opened its doors in November 1863. Mrs. Blackwood's records, when later discovered by authorities, showed careful documentation of each death with medical explanations that satisfied legal requirements while concealing the truth. The surviving children lived in constant terror, knowing that their own lives hung by the thinnest of threads. Any sign of weakness, defiance, or knowledge that Mrs. Blackwood deemed dangerous could result in joining the growing number of young souls buried in unmarked graves. Would you have found the strength to survive in an environment where death was used as a tool of control, or would the constant fear have broken your spirit entirely? Dr. Ezekiel Morrison had practiced medicine in Herman for over 20 years when Mrs. Blackwood's boarding house opened in November 1863. At 62, he was the town's most respected physician, a man whose word carried weight in legal proceedings and whose medical opinions were rarely questioned by local authorities. This reputation made his complicity in Mrs. Blackwood's operation particularly devastating and effective. Morrison's relationship with the boarding house began innocuously enough. Mrs. Blackwood had approached him shortly after opening her facility, explaining that she needed a physician to provide regular medical care for the orphaned children in her charge. She offered to pay him a monthly retainer of $25, significant income for a doctor whose practice had declined during the war years as patients struggled to pay for medical services. The arrangement suited both parties perfectly. Morrison would make monthly visits to 1247 Elm Street, conducting cursory examinations of the children and providing medical certification that they were fit for their assigned labors. More importantly, he would sign death certificates when children died, lending official medical authority to explanations that concealed the true causes of their deaths. Morrison's first visit to the boarding house should have raised immediate alarm. The children he examined showed obvious signs of malnutrition, overwork, and physical abuse. Their hollow cheeks, stunted growth, and various injuries spoke to conditions that no legitimate charitable institution would tolerate. But Morrison had already accepted Mrs. Blackwood's monthly payment, and his financial dependence on her operation colored his professional judgment. The doctor developed a system of willful blindness that allowed him to maintain the pretense of medical care while ignoring overwhelming evidence of abuse. He attributed signs of malnutrition to natural constitutional weakness, common among children of inferior breeding. Injuries that clearly resulted from dangerous working conditions were explained as accidents typical of clumsy youngsters learning proper work habits. When children died under suspicious circumstances, Morrison crafted death certificates that cited vague medical conditions while avoiding any language that might trigger official investigations. The most damning evidence of Morrison's complicity came in his treatment of children who had been severely injured in industrial accidents. Rather than demanding improved working conditions or reporting dangerous labor practices to authorities, he simply patched up the wounded children and certified them as fit to return to duties as quickly as possible. His medical bag became a tool for maintaining Mrs. Blackwood's operation rather than protecting the health and welfare of vulnerable children. Morrison's corruption extended beyond mere negligence into active participation in covering up crimes. When 14-year-old Emma Caldwell died under circumstances that suggested pregnancy and possible infanticide, Morrison's death certificate attributed her death to consumption complicated by hysteria, a diagnosis so vague it was essentially meaningless but sufficient to prevent further investigation. Local residents, trusting in Morrison's reputation and medical authority, accepted his explanations without question. Parents in neighboring towns who had lost track of children sent to Mrs. Blackwood's boarding house were reassured by the doctor's official statements about their welfare and medical care. Morrison's betrayal of his medical oath transformed him from a healer into an enabler of systematic child abuse and murder. Do you think Dr. Morrison genuinely convinced himself that he was helping the children, or did he knowingly participate in their exploitation for financial gain? Reverend Marcus Fitzhugh of Herman's First Methodist Church had built his reputation on passionate sermons about Christian duty to society's most vulnerable members. His Sunday morning exhortations about caring for widows and orphans drew nods of approval from congregations who prided themselves on their moral superiority to less godly communities. So when Mrs. Cordelia Blackwood approached him in December 1863 seeking his endorsement for her charitable work with displaced children, Reverend Fitzhugh was eager to associate his ministry with such an obviously virtuous enterprise. The Reverend's first visit to 1247 Elm Street was carefully orchestrated by Mrs. Blackwood, who had learned from Inspector Carruthers' earlier visit how to transform her boarding house into a theatrical performance. On the appointed Sunday afternoon, Fitzhugh arrived to find children engaged in Bible study, their clean faces reflecting what appeared to be proper Christian upbringing. Mrs. Blackwood led him through rooms that bore no resemblance to the boarding house's normal conditions, explaining her philosophy of combining charitable care with practical education. Fitzhugh was particularly impressed by the children's ability to recite biblical passages and their apparent gratitude for Mrs. Blackwood's care. 10-year-old Emma Caldwell delivered a carefully rehearsed testimonial about how the boarding house had saved her from a life of sin and degradation, bringing tears to the Reverend's eyes. What he didn't realize was that Emma had been coached for days, with Mrs. Blackwood making clear that any deviation from the approved script would result in severe punishment for all the children. The Reverend's endorsement proved invaluable for Mrs. Blackwood's operation. His December 1863 sermon praising her Christian enterprise and her success in transforming vagrant children into productive members of society was reprinted in the local newspaper and distributed to Methodist congregations throughout central Missouri. Fitzhugh's moral authority gave Mrs. Blackwood's operation a legitimacy that helped deflect suspicion and attract new sources of orphaned children. More disturbingly, Fitzhugh became an active recruiter for the boarding house. During his travels to other congregations, he would identify communities struggling with orphaned children and recommend Mrs. Blackwood's institution as a solution to their problems. His religious authority made local officials more willing to transfer custody of homeless children to what appeared to be a respectable Methodist-endorsed facility. The Reverend's monthly visits to 1247 Elm Street continued throughout 1864, but they became increasingly perfunctory as he grew more invested in maintaining the fiction he had helped create. He chose not to notice the hollow eyes and haunted expressions that had replaced the cheerful faces he remembered from his first visit. When children began dying with suspicious frequency, Fitzhugh accepted Dr. Morrison's medical explanations and offered prayers for God's mysterious ways, rather than investigating conditions that might have prevented the deaths. Fitzhugh's corruption was different from Dr. Morrison's financial motivation or Mrs. Blackwood's cold calculation. The Reverend genuinely believed he was participating in godly work, but his pride in being associated with a successful charitable enterprise blinded him to evidence that contradicted his assumptions. His moral blindness was perhaps more dangerous than outright villainy because it provided Mrs. Blackwood's operation with the blessing of religious authority that made questioning it seem almost sacrilegious. If a respected religious leader endorsed an institution, would you have trusted that endorsement enough to ignore your own suspicions, or would you have investigated further? Hidden beneath loose floorboards in Mrs. Blackwood's private study lay the true record of her operation, a leather-bound ledger that documented the systematic exploitation of vulnerable children with the cold precision of a business accounting book. Each child who passed through 1247 Elm Street was reduced to numbers. Acquisition costs, daily earnings, maintenance expenses, and profit margins calculated with mathematical indifference to human suffering. The ledger's pages revealed the horrifying scope of Mrs. Blackwood's enterprise. By the summer of 1864, she had processed 43 children through her boarding house with detailed financial records showing the profit generated by each young life. 7-year-old Timothy Morse, despite his small size and frequent illness, had earned Mrs. Blackwood $127 during his 8 months at the boarding house. Income generated through his factory work minus the minimal costs of feeding, housing, and clothing him. Mrs. Blackwood's accounting system treated children like livestock, with careful notations about their physical condition, work capacity, and market value. Strong, healthy children were marked with green ink indicating their premium earning potential. Those showing signs of illness or injury received yellow markings that classified them as declining assets, requiring either medical intervention or disposal. Red ink marked children whose continued existence posed risks to the operation. Those who had witnessed too much, complained too loudly, or showed signs of rebellion that might spread to other residents. The ledger documented Mrs. Blackwood's expansion beyond Herman's city limits. Entries from spring 1864 showed payments to scouts in Kansas City, Jefferson City, and St. Louis, who identified orphaned children suitable for her operation. Brother Thomas Kellerman alone had provided 14 children, earning $5 for each successful delivery, money that represented a child's transition from homelessness to a form of slavery that was arguably worse than their previous circumstances. Perhaps most chilling were the ledger's mortality calculations. Mrs. Blackwood had determined that a certain percentage of child deaths was acceptable and even profitable, as it eliminated the costs of caring for children who were no longer productive workers. Her notes indicated that she considered a 15% annual mortality rate within acceptable business parameters, a cold calculation that treated young lives as expendable resources in her profit-making enterprise. The financial records also revealed the broader network of complicity that made Mrs. Blackwood's operation possible. Regular payments to Dr. Morrison for medical services, monthly fees to local officials for administrative cooperation, and donations to Reverend Fitzhugh's church that ensured his continued endorsement, all documented with the same methodical precision that characterized every aspect of her business. Most disturbing were the projections Mrs. Blackwood had made for expanding her operation. Her calculations suggested that similar boarding houses could be established in other Missouri towns, creating a statewide network of child exploitation that could generate thousands of dollars in annual profit. She had already begun correspondence with potential partners in Kansas and Illinois, sharing her operational methods and financial projections. The ledger represented more than financial records. It was a window into a mind that had completely dehumanized vulnerable children, viewing them as nothing more than profit-generating commodities in an enterprise that combined the worst elements of slavery and industrial capitalism. Tell me in the comments, do you think Mrs. Blackwood saw herself as a businesswoman solving social problems, or did she understand the evil nature of her actions? Herman's citizens prided themselves on being a respectable German-American community where hard work, moral virtue, and Christian charity defined their social identity. But by the summer of 1864, maintaining these ideals required an extraordinary exercise in willful blindness that allowed Mrs. Blackwood's horrific operation to continue with minimal interference from local authorities or concerned residents. The signs of systematic child abuse were impossible to ignore for anyone who chose to see them. Children from 1247 Elm Street moved through Herman's streets like ghosts, their hollow eyes and skeletal frames telling stories of malnutrition and overwork that contradicted official narratives about Christian charity. They walked to their work assignments in small groups, heads down, speaking in whispers if they spoke at all. Their clothing was patched and threadbare, inadequate protection against Missouri's harsh weather. Most tellingly, they displayed the characteristic behaviors of traumatized children, flinching at sudden movements, avoiding eye contact with adults, and maintaining a hypervigilance that spoke to lives lived in constant fear. Shop owners who served these children noticed their desperate hunger and the way they gazed longingly at food they couldn't afford. Martha Schneider, who operated Herman's general store, later recalled how Mrs. Blackwood's children would press their faces against her window displays, staring at penny candy and basic groceries with an intensity that suggested severe deprivation. But rather than investigating why children in an allegedly well-managed charitable institution appeared to be starving, she and other merchants simply accepted Mrs. Blackwood's explanations about teaching fiscal responsibility and preventing spoiled behavior. The frequent deaths and disappearances of children from the boarding house should have triggered community alarm, but Herman's citizens found ways to rationalize what they witnessed. Dr. Morrison's medical explanations provided convenient cover for residents who preferred not to examine uncomfortable truths too closely. Reverend Fitzhugh's continued endorsement of Mrs. Blackwood's work gave the operation religious legitimacy that made questioning it seem almost impious. Local officials pointed to proper paperwork and regular inspections as evidence that everything was operating within legal bounds. Economic considerations also influenced the community's willful blindness. Mrs. Blackwood's operation provided cheap labor that local businesses had become dependent upon. Mill owners, farmers, and wealthy households relied on children from 1247 Elm Street to perform dangerous, difficult, or menial work at wages far below what adult workers would demand. Acknowledging the abuse would have required confronting their own complicity in exploiting vulnerable children for economic advantage. Social dynamics played a role as well. Mrs. Blackwood had cultivated relationships with Herman's most influential citizens, making regular donations to local churches and civic organizations. She attended social gatherings, participated in community events, and maintained the appearance of a respectable widow performing charitable work. Challenging her operation would have required admitting that the community's social leaders had been deceived, or worse, that they had knowingly endorsed child exploitation. The psychological mechanism of willful blindness allowed Herman's residents to maintain their self-image as moral Christian people while tolerating systematic abuse of the most vulnerable members of society. This community-wide complicity ensured that Mrs. Blackwood's operation could continue expanding its scope and refining its methods of exploitation without significant interference from local authorities or concerned citizens. Do you believe communities genuinely couldn't recognize obvious signs of child abuse, or did economic and social pressures create incentives to ignore what was happening in plain sight? By August 1864, the psychological and physical toll on the surviving children at 1247 Elm Street had reached a critical breaking point. The combination of malnutrition, overwork, constant fear, and witnessing the deaths or disappearances of their companions had created a powder keg of desperation that even Mrs. Blackwood's iron control couldn't completely contain. The children who remained alive were hollow shells of their former selves, but desperation had begun to overcome their trained compliance. 13-year-old Mary O'Brien, who had watched her younger brother Thomas die and her friend James Hartford disappear, became the reluctant leader of what historians would later call the Elm Street Rebellion. Her transformation from broken victim to fierce advocate for survival began when 9-year-old Lucy Patterson arrived at the boarding house in July 1864, her parents having died in a cholera outbreak near St. Charles. Lucy's initial innocence and hope reminded Mary of who she had been before months of abuse had numbed her capacity for feeling. The catalyst came when Mrs. Blackwood announced that Lucy would be assigned to work at a leather tanning operation outside Herman, a position that previous children had described as tantamount to a death sentence due to the toxic chemicals and dangerous working conditions involved. That night, as Lucy wept quietly in her dormitory bed, something crystallized in Mary's mind. They were all going to die in this place unless someone found the courage to act. Mary began secretly organizing the surviving children, using whispered conversations during their brief work breaks to coordinate what would become the most desperate gamble of their young lives. Unlike the failed escape attempt in April, this wouldn't be a plan for 3 children to slip away in darkness. This would be a coordinated effort by every surviving resident of 1247 Elm Street to expose Mrs. Blackwood's operation to the outside world, regardless of the personal consequences. The plan was simple, but required extraordinary courage from children who had been systematically broken by months of abuse. During Mrs. Blackwood's next monthly tea party, a social gathering where she displayed her successful charitable work to Herman's leading citizens, the children would break their enforced silence and tell their stories to the assembled community leaders. They would describe the working conditions, the punishments, the deaths, and the systematic exploitation that had been hidden behind a facade of Christian charity. Mary knew the plan would likely result in severe punishment or death for those who participated, but she had concluded that their current circumstances were already a form of slow execution. At least this way, their deaths might serve a purpose by exposing the truth about Mrs. Blackwood's operation and potentially saving other children from similar fates. The children understood they were essentially committing suicide by speaking out, but they had reached a point where the possibility of ending their suffering outweighed their fear of Mrs. Blackwood's retaliation. On August 15, 1864, as Herman's social elite gathered in Mrs. Blackwood's parlor for afternoon tea and moral self-congratulation, they had no idea they were about to witness the most explosive revelation in the town's history. Would you have found the courage to speak truth to power, knowing it would likely cost you your life, or would self-preservation have kept you silent? Mrs. Blackwood's parlor had never looked more elegant than on the afternoon of August 15, 1864, when she hosted what would become the most infamous tea party in Herman's history. Crystal glasses caught the Missouri sunlight streaming through lace curtains, while delicate china displayed an array of pastries and sandwiches that represented more food than the boarding house children usually saw in a week. The guest list read like a directory of the town's most influential citizens: Judge Cornelius Hartwell, Reverend Marcus Fitzhugh, banker Jeremiah Pemberton, mill owner Heinrich Gottfried, and 6 other prominent community leaders who had praised Mrs. Blackwood's charitable work. The afternoon began with Mrs. Blackwood's customary presentation about her successful rehabilitation of vagrant children. She spoke eloquently about transforming society's unwanted burdens into productive, God-fearing citizens through a combination of Christian instruction and honest labor. Her guests nodded approvingly, sipping tea while congratulating themselves on supporting such worthy charitable work. Judge Hartwell was particularly effusive in his praise, noting how the boarding house had solved the community's problem of caring for war orphans while providing valuable workers for local businesses. The children, as usual, were presented as living testimonials to Mrs. Blackwood's methods. Dressed in clean clothes that had been acquired specifically for such occasions, they filed into the parlor to demonstrate their progress in reading, writing, and Christian instruction. 10-year-old Emma Caldwell began the familiar routine of reciting biblical passages that emphasized obedience, humility, and gratitude for charitable care. But this time was different. As Emma reached the verse about suffering the little children to come unto me, her voice began to tremble with something other, the nervousness. She stopped mid-recitation, looked directly at Judge Hartwell, and spoke words that shattered the carefully constructed facade. "Sir, we are not grateful. We are dying here. Mrs. Blackwood is killing us." The room fell into stunned silence. Mrs. Blackwood's teacup clattered to the floor as she rose from her chair, but before she could silence Emma, 13-year-old Mary O'Brien stepped forward and continued the revelation. In a clear, steady voice that carried the authority of desperate truth, Mary began describing the working conditions, the basement punishments, the inadequate food, and the mysterious deaths that had claimed nearly half of the children who had entered 1247 Elm Street. One by one, the surviving children added their voices to Mary's testimony. 9-year-old Lucy Patterson showed the guests scars from factory machinery that had mangled her small hands. 12-year-old David Morrison, no relation to Dr. Morrison, pulled up his shirt to reveal welts from Mrs. Blackwood's punishment implements. 8-year-old Sophie Hartwell, ironically sharing the judge's surname, described working 14-hour days in conditions that had left her permanently weakened and undersized. The children's testimony was devastating in its detail and impossible to dismiss as childish imagination or ingratitude. They named specific businesses, described particular incidents, and provided a comprehensive account of systematic abuse that contradicted every official report and public statement about the boarding house's operations. Mrs. Blackwood's carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation was crumbling in real time, exposed by the very victim she had thought she had broken beyond the possibility of resistance. If you had been one of those community leaders hearing this testimony, would you have believed the children immediately, or would you have keyed for ways to dismiss their accusations? The silence that followed the children's testimony stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the ticking of Mrs. Blackwood's grandfather clock and the labored breathing of guests struggling to process accusations that challenged everything they believed about their community's moral character. The elegant parlor, moments before filled with the comfortable murmur of social conversation, had been transformed into a courtroom where Herman's most respected citizens found themselves confronted with evidence of their own complicity in systematic child abuse. Judge Cornelius Hartwell was the first to speak, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he typically reserved for his courtroom. "These are serious allegations," he said, his eyes moving from the trembling children to Mrs. Blackwood's pale face. "But we must remember that disturbed children often fabricate stories to gain attention or escape proper discipline." His words reflected the cognitive dissonance of a man whose professional reputation depended on the boarding house contracts he had approved and whose legal authority had sanctioned Mrs. Blackwood's operation. Reverend Fitzhugh, whose endorsement had provided religious legitimacy for the boarding house, struggled visibly with the implications of the children's testimony. His face flushed as he recalled his glowing sermons about Mrs. Blackwood's charitable work and the realization that his moral authority had been used to enable child exploitation. Yet rather than acknowledging his error, he fell back on theological explanations. Perhaps these trials are part of God's plan to test these children's faith and build their character through adversity. Banker Jeremiah Pemberton, whose own household employed 11-year-old Catherine Mills as a domestic servant, shifted uncomfortably in his chair as he realized the implications for his family's treatment of their young worker. His wife Constance had often praised Catherine's excellent training and proper obedience. But the child's testimony about impossible working hours and cruel punishments made their comfortable lifestyle suddenly seem built on exploitation they had chosen not to see. Mill owner Heinrich Gottfried's reaction was perhaps most telling. As the children described the dangerous working conditions and industrial accidents that had maimed and killed their companions, Gottfried's face showed not surprise but the expression of a man whose private knowledge was being made uncomfortably public. He had known about the injuries, the excessive hours, and the inappropriate use of child labor in his facility, but the economic advantages had outweighed his moral concerns. Mrs. Blackwood herself remained eerily calm during the children's testimony, her calculating mind already working to minimize the damage to her operation. She understood that the gathered community leaders had too much invested in the fiction of her charitable work to abandon it easily. Their own reputations, business interests, and self-image as moral citizens depended on maintaining the pretense that they had been deceived rather than complicit. The most disturbing aspect of the guests' reactions was not outright denial, but the subtle ways they began constructing narratives that would allow them to continue ignoring the evidence of systematic abuse while preserving their own sense of moral righteousness. The children watched these adult faces and realized that even their desperate courage might not be enough to overcome the powerful interests that had enabled Mrs. Blackwood's operation to flourish. Do you think these community leaders were genuinely shocked by the revelations, or were they primarily concerned about protecting their own reputations and interests? As the weight of the children's accusations settled over her parlor like a suffocating fog, Mrs. Cordelia Blackwood demonstrated the calculating brilliance that had enabled her operation to flourish for nearly a year. Rather than collapsing under the pressure of exposure, she marshaled her considerable skills of manipulation and began constructing a defense that would preserve her enterprise while discrediting her young accusers. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the wounded dignity of a woman unjustly accused, "what you're witnessing is the unfortunate result of my excessive kindness toward children who have been corrupted by lives of vagrancy and moral degradation." She moved gracefully through the parlor, her black dress rustling with each calculated step as she positioned herself as the victim rather than the perpetrator of abuse. "I have devoted my life and fortune to rescuing these unfortunate souls from lives of sin and degradation, and this is how they repay Christian charity." Mrs. Blackwood's strategy was masterful in its psychological sophistication. She acknowledged certain harsh realities while reframing them as necessary medicine for children who had been ruined by their previous circumstances. Yes, the work was demanding, but idle hands led to moral corruption. Yes, discipline was strict, but these children had never learned proper obedience and required firm guidance. Yes, some children had died, but they had arrived at the boarding house already weakened by malnutrition and disease from their vagrant lifestyles. "Look at their faces," she continued, gesturing toward the trembling children. "Do you see gratitude for the food, shelter, and moral instruction they have received? Do you see appreciation for the valuable trades they have learned? No. You see the sullen resentment of children who resent being held accountable for their behavior and who would prefer to return to lives of begging, theft, and moral dissolution." Her defense became more sophisticated as she addressed specific allegations. The basement punishments were reflection rooms where children could contemplate their misbehavior in quiet solitude. The excessive working hours were apprenticeships that prepared orphaned children for productive adult lives. The inadequate food was controlled portions designed to teach fiscal responsibility and prevent the gluttony that had characterized their vagrant existence. Most cleverly, Mrs. Blackwood turned the children's own testimony against them by highlighting inconsistencies and emotional outbursts that made them appear unreliable witnesses. When 9-year-old Lucy Patterson began crying while describing her treatment, Mrs. Blackwood pointed to her tears as evidence of the emotional instability that made proper discipline necessary. When Mary O'Brien's voice shook with anger while recounting specific incidents of abuse, Mrs. Blackwood characterized this as proof of the ungrateful disposition that had made harsh correction inevitable. She concluded her defense with a masterpiece of moral manipulation. "If these children's accusations were true, would I have invited Herman's most respected citizens to witness their condition? Would I have opened my home to your inspection if I had anything to hide? The very fact that you are here, seeing these children for yourselves, proves that I have nothing to conceal and everything to be proud of." Mrs. Blackwood's defense was designed not to convince anyone of her complete innocence, but to provide the community leaders with plausible justifications for continuing to support her operation despite the disturbing evidence they had witnessed. Would you have been swayed by Mrs. Blackwood's skillful reframing of the situation, or would the children's raw testimony have been more convincing than her polished explanations? The fate of Mrs. Blackwood's operation and the lives of the children who had found the courage to speak truth to power hung in the balance as Herman's most influential citizens struggled with a desist iron that would define their community's moral character for generations. The elegant parlor had become a courtroom where the testimony of traumatized children competed against the sophisticated manipulations of a woman who had built her empire on their suffering. Judge Cornelius Hartwell found himself in an impossible position. His legal career and personal reputation were inextricably linked to the boarding house contracts he had approved and the child labor arrangements he had sanctioned. Acknowledging the truth of the children's testimony would require admitting that his own judicial decisions had enabled systematic abuse. Yet the evidence before him was overwhelming and impossible to dismiss entirely. The judge's internal struggle was visible on his weathered face as he weighed legal responsibilities against personal interests. He had built his career on the principle that the law should protect society's most vulnerable members, but that same legal system had been perverted to enable Mrs. Blackwood's exploitation of orphaned children. The contracts he had approved, the labor arrangements he had sanctioned, and the death certificates he had accepted without investigation, all had contributed to the suffering detailed in the children's testimony. Reverend Fitzhugh faced his own crisis of faith and conscience. His endorsement of Mrs. Blackwood's work had provided religious legitimacy that helped silence potential critics and attract new victims to the boarding house. His sermons about Christian charity had been used to justify a system that represented the antithesis of everything his faith claimed to value. The children's hollow eyes and trembling voices challenged not only his judgment but his understanding of his own moral authority. The other community leaders, mill owners, bankers, merchants, and civic officials realized that their comfortable lives and profitable businesses had been built, at least partially, on the exploitation of vulnerable children. The cheap labor provided by Mrs. Blackwood's operative iron had increased their profits while allowing them to maintain the fiction that they were supporting charitable work. Their silence and willing blindness had been purchased with economic advantages that made acknowledging the truth financially as well as morally costly. As the minutes ticked by in tense silence, Mrs. Blackwood watched the faces of her guests with the calculating attention of a predator assessing potential threats. She understood that these men had too much invested in her operation's success to abandon it easily. Their reputations, their business interests, and their self-image as moral community leaders all depended on finding a way to continue supporting her work while addressing the uncomfortable evidence they had witnessed. The children, exhausted by their emotional testimony and terrified by the potential consequences of their courage, waited to learn whether their desperate gamble had succeeded or whether they had merely sealed their own doom by challenging the powerful interests that profited from their suffering. The next words spoken in that parlor would determine whether Herman, Missouri would confront the evil in its midst or find more sophisticated ways to ignore it. Imagine you were in that room. Would you have had the moral courage to act on the children's testimony, even if it meant acknowledging your own complicity in their suffering? Judge Hartwell's decision, when it finally came, revealed the depths of corruption that had infected Herman's leadership. Rising slowly from his chair, the man whose legal authority was supposed to protect society's most vulnerable members delivered a verdict that prioritized institutional stability over justice for abused children. "While these allegations are concerning," he said, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "we must remember that disturbed children often fabricate stories too. Avoid proper discipline. However, to ensure complete propriety, I will personally oversee improvements to the boarding house's operations." His words launched what would become one of Missouri's most shameful cover-ups, a coordinated effort by community leaders to suppress evidence of systematic child abuse while maintaining the profitable arrangements that had made them complicit in Mrs. Blackwood's crimes. The judge's promise of personal oversight was designed not to protect the children, but to provide legal cover for continuing the operation with minor cosmetic changes that would satisfy concerned observers without addressing the fundamental exploitation. Reverend Fitzhugh immediately endorsed the judge's decision, framing it in religious terms that made opposition seem impious. "We must remember that Christian charity requires us to support Mrs. Blackwood's redemptive work with these troubled children," he announced, his voice carrying the moral authority that had helped legitimize the boarding house from its inception. Judge Hartwell's wise supervision will ensure that this important ministry continues to transform young lives through proper discipline and honest labor. The other community leaders quickly fell in line, each offering suggestions for improvements that were carefully crafted to address public concerns without threatening their economic interests. Mill owner Gottfried proposed enhanced safety training for child workers, a meaningless gesture that would allow him to continue using dangerous child labor while claiming to prioritize safety. Banker Pemberton suggested regular community inspections that would be as carefully choreographed as Mrs. Blackwood's previous theatrical performances for visiting officials. The children watched in horror as their desperate courage was transformed into justification for more sophisticated oppression. Their testimony about abuse and exploitation was reframed as evidence that they needed stronger discipline and more intensive moral instruction. Their AC counts of dangerous working conditions became proof that they required better training rather than protection from hazardous labor. Their descriptions of inadequate food and shelter were interpreted as ingratitude that demonstrated the necessity for continued strict management. Mrs. Blackwood herself remained silent during the community leaders' discussion, but her slight smile revealed her understanding that she had not only survived the challenge to her authority, but had actually strengthened her position. The judge's promise of personal oversight would provide additional legitimacy for her operation, while the community leader's public endorsement would make future criticism more difficult. The cover-up's most sinister aspect was how it transformed the children's act of courage into evidence that justified their continued suffering. Their willingness to speak truth to power was reinterpreted as proof that they were ungrateful, disturbed, and in need of the harsh discipline that Mrs. Blackwood provided. As the tea party concluded with handshakes and promises of continued cooperation, the children realized that their desperate gamble had not only failed, but had actually made their situation worse. Tell me in the comments, do you think these community leaders genuinely believed they were making the right decision, or did they knowingly choose institutional protection over children's welfare? The immediate aftermath of the Tea Party revelation brought a reign of terror to 1247 Elm Street that made the previous months of abuse seem almost gentle by comparison. Mrs. Blackwood understood that the children's public testimony, even though it had been successfully suppressed by community leaders, represented a fundamental threat to her authority that required decisive action. The basement punishment room, already a chamber of horrors, was transformed into something even more sinister as she demonstrated the consequences of challenging her power. Mary O'Brien, who had led the children's testimony, was the first to experience Mrs. Blackwood's enhanced brutality. For 3 days following the tea party, she was chained in the basement with no food or water while Mrs. Blackwood considered appropriate punishment for her ingratitude and defiance. When Mary finally emerged, the other children barely recognized the hollow-eyed, trembling girl who had once been their source of strength and hope. She never spoke above a whisper again, and her left hand bore permanent damage from the shackles that had cut off circulation during her imprisonment. The other children who had participated in the testimony faced their own forms of escalated punishment designed to break their spirits completely. 9-year-old Lucy Patterson was assigned to work at the most dangerous stations in Gottfried's Mill, where industrial accidents were not only likely but virtually inevitable. 8-year-old Sophie Hartwell found herself working 18-hour days as a domestic servant in households where her employers had been specifically instructed to ensure proper discipline for her ungrateful behavior. Mrs. Blackwood's new system of control went beyond physical punishment to include psychological torture that was arguably more devastating than the beatings and starvation. Children were forced to witness punishments inflicted on their friends, creating an atmosphere of constant terror where any display of sympathy or solidarity with fellow victims resulted in severe consequences. The basement echoed with the sounds of suffering as Mrs. Blackwood demonstrated that resistance would be met with brutality that made previous abuse seem merciful. The boarding house's mortality rate, already alarming, increased dramatically in the weeks following the tea party. Children who had been marginally healthy before the testimony began succumbing to illnesses that Dr. Morrison dutifully documented without investigation. The official explanations became more creative: consumption complicated by defiance, fever brought on by ingratitude, and weakness resulting from moral corruption. But the pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Most chillingly, Mrs. Blackwood began implementing what she called preventive corrections, punishments designed to suppress rebellion before it could develop. Children were subjected to regular basement sessions intended to remind them of the consequences of defiance, while new arrivals received immediate and brutal lessons about the futility of resistance. The escalated brutality served multiple purposes. It satisfied Mrs. Blackwood's desire for revenge against children who had dared to challenge her authority. It provided a powerful deterrent against future acts of courage. and it demonstrated to the community leaders who had endorsed her operation that she remained firmly in control of her charitable enterprise. The children who survived this period emerged permanently changed, their spirits broken by suffering that exceeded the boundaries of human endurance. Would you have been able to maintain hope for survival in conditions where courage was met with torture and resistance resulted in death? In September 1864, an unsigned letter arrived at the offices of the St. Louis, Missouri Democrat, one of the state's most influential newspapers. Written in careful script that disguised the author's identity, the letter contained allegations about a boarding house in Hermann, Missouri that were so shocking they initially seemed like the fantasies of a disturbed mind. But the specific details, precise names, and documented incidents described in the 3-page missive suggested knowledge that could only come from someone with intimate access to Mrs. Blackwood's operation. The letter's author remained anonymous, but internal evidence suggested it came from someone within Hermann. And as community who had witnessed the Tea Party testimony and been horrified by the subsequent cover-up, possibly a servant who had overheard conversations among the community leaders, or perhaps even one of Mrs. Blackwood's adult contacts who had finally been moved to action by the escalating brutality, the mysterious correspondent provided the first outside challenge to the conspiracy of silence that protected 1247 Elm Street. "Gentlemen," the letter began, "I write to inform you of crimes against innocent children that are being committed with the knowledge and approval of local authorities in Hermann, Missouri. A woman named Mrs. Cordelia Blackwood operates what she claims is a charitable boarding house for orphaned children, but which is actually a system of slavery and murder that has claimed the lives of dozens of young souls whose only crime was being born into poverty and misfortune." The letter detailed specific incidents that had not been publicly reported: the mysterious disappearances of James Hartford and Samuel Worth, the suspicious deaths of children who had shown signs of rebellion, and the systematic exploitation of child labor that generated profits for local businesses while slowly killing the workers. Most damning were the accusations about community leaders' complicity, naming Judge Hartwell, Reverend Fitzhugh, Dr. Morrison, and other respected citizens as knowing participants in covering up evidence of systematic abuse. What made the letter particularly credible was its inclusion of financial information that would have been impossible for an outsider to obtain. The correspondent provided details about payments to Dr. Morrison for falsifying death certificates, donations to Reverend Fitzhugh's church that purchased his endorsement, and the specific amounts that businesses paid Mrs. Blackwood for child labor. These financial details suggested access to records that only someone within Mrs. Blackwood's inner circle could have provided. The letter concluded with a desperate plea that reflected the author's understanding of the powerful interests protecting Mrs. Blackwood's operation. Local authorities will not act because they profit from these crimes. Only outside intervention can save the children who remain alive in that house of horrors. I beg you to investigate before more innocent lives are lost to greed and moral cowardice. Missouri Democrat editor Benjamin Gratz Brown, a man whose political career had been built on opposing slavery and advocating for social justice, initially struggled with whether to publish such explosive allegations without independent verification. But the letter's details were too specific and its accusations too serious to ignore completely. His decision to investigate would finally bring outside scrutiny to Herman's carefully guarded secret. Do you think the anonymous letter writer was motivated by genuine moral outrage, or might they have had personal reasons for wanting to expose Mrs. Blackwood's operation? Benjamin Gratz Brown's decision to investigate the anonymous letter's allegations launched the first serious outside scrutiny of Mrs. Blackwood's operation since the boarding house opened nearly a year earlier. The Missouri Democrat's editor understood that publishing unverified accusations against a charitable institution could destroy his newspaper's credibility. But the letter's specific details and financial information demanded professional investigation by reporters trained to separate fact from fiction. Brown assigned the story to his most experienced investigative correspondent, Henry Walsh, a veteran journalist whose coverage of corruption in St. Louis politics had earned him both respect and enemies throughout Missouri. Walsh approached the assignment with the skepticism of a man who had spent decades exposing elaborate frauds and sophisticated cover-ups, but also with the moral outrage of someone who understood that protecting children from exploitation was fundamental to civilized society. Walsh's initial investigation began in St. Louis, where he examined state records related to charitable institutions and child welfare organizations. What he discovered immediately raised red flags. Mrs. Blackwood's boarding house had been registered with minimal documentation. Its financial reports were virtually non-existent, and the state inspections that supposedly verified its operations were so perfunctory as to be meaningless. More troubling was the pattern of death certificates that Dr. Morrison had filed for children from the boarding house, a mortality rate that was statistically impossible for a legitimate charitable institution. The journalist's next step was a carefully planned visit to Herman, where he posed as a traveling businessman interested in Mrs. Blackwood's methods for managing orphaned children. His cover story was that he represented charitable organizations in Illinois that were considering establishing similar boarding houses and needed information about operational procedures and financial structures. Mrs. Blackwood's response to Walsh's inquiry revealed both her confidence in the protection she enjoyed from local authorities and her willingness to expand her operation beyond Missouri's borders. She welcomed him warmly, provided detailed information about her successful methods for transforming vagrant children into productive workers, and even offered to demonstrate her operational procedures during his visit. What Mrs. Blackwood didn't realize was that Walsh's trained eye immediately recognized evidence of systematic abuse that local officials had chosen to ignore. The children he observed bore obvious signs of malnutrition, overwork, and psychological trauma. Their behavior, the flinching at sudden movements, the hollow stares, and the mechanical responses to questions, spoke to living conditions that contradicted every official report about the boarding house's operations. Most damning was Walsh's discovery that several children who were supposed to be residents of the boarding house were actually dead or missing, their continued presence in official records maintained as part of the financial fraud that supported Mrs. Blackwood's operation. The journalist realized he was not just investigating child abuse, but a complex criminal enterprise that combined human trafficking, labor exploitation, and murder with sophisticated record-keeping designed to deceive state authorities. His investigation would expose not only Mrs. Blackwood's crimes, but the network of complicity that had enabled them to flourish in a community that prided itself on moral virtue and Christian charity. If you were the journalist, would you have published your findings immediately to save the remaining children, or continued investigating to build a more comprehensive case? On October 15, 1864, the St. Louis, Missouri Democrat published what would become one of the most shocking exposés in Missouri journalism history. Spread across the newspaper's front page under the headline, "House of Horrors, the Sinister Boarding House that Harvests Orphans for Profit," Henry Walsh's investigation revealed the full scope of Mrs. Blackwood's operation and the network of complicity that had enabled it to flourish for nearly a year. The article's opening paragraphs were crafted to shock readers out of complacency. In the town of Herman, Missouri, a woman operating under the guise of Christian charity has systematically tortured, exploited, and murdered dozens of orphan children, while local authorities not only failed to intervene, but actively participated in covering up her crimes. Mrs. Cordelia Blackwood's boarding house at 1247 Elm Street represents not merely individual evil, but the collective moral failure of an entire community. Walsh's reporting was methodical and devious. He documented specific deaths, naming children who had died under suspicious circumstances while providing evidence that contradicted official medical explanations. He detailed the working conditions in local mills and factories, describing industrial accidents that had maimed and killed child workers while their employers continued to profit from their labor. Most damaging were the financial records he had obtained, showing the payments between Mrs. Blackwood, local businesses, and community officials that revealed the economic incentives behind the conspiracy of silence. The journalist's most powerful weapon was his first-hand observations during his visit to Herman. He described the children's physical appearance in clinical detail, their hollow cheeks, stunted growth, and obvious injuries, while contrasting these conditions with official reports that praised Mrs. Blackwood's charitable work. His interview with Mrs. Blackwood herself revealed a woman so confident in her protection by local authorities that she openly discussed methods for maximizing profit from child labor. Perhaps most shocking to readers was Walsh's documentation of community leaders' complicity in the operation. He named Judge Hartwell, Reverend Fitzhugh, Dr. Morrison, and other respected citizens as knowing participants in covering up evidence of systematic abuse. His reporting showed how their business interests, professional relationships, and social connections had created incentives to ignore obvious signs of criminal activity. The article concluded with a challenge that resonated throughout Missouri. If we cannot protect the most vulnerable members of our society from such systematic exploitation, what claim do we have to calling ourselves a Christian civilization? The crimes committed at 1247 Elm Street represent not merely the actions of one evil woman, but the moral bankruptcy of a community that chose profit over the protection of innocent children. The exposé's publication sent shockwaves through Missouri's political and social establishment. Within hours of the newspaper's distribution, telegrams were flooding Herman's telegraph office as state officials, religious leaders, and concerned citizens demanded answers about the allegations. Mrs. Blackwood's carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation was finally crumbling under the weight of outside scrutiny that local authorities could neither control nor suppress. The children who had survived nearly a year of systematic abuse finally had reason to hope that their suffering might soon end. Would you have believed such shocking allegations if you had read them in your local newspaper, or would you have dismissed them as exaggerated journalism designed to sell papers? The state's response to the Missouri Democrats' exposé was swift and overwhelming. Within 48 hours of the article's publication, Missouri Attorney General James Broadhead had dispatched a team of investigators to Herman with orders to conduct a thorough examination of Mrs. Blackwood's operation and the local officials who had enabled it. Unlike the perfunctory inspections that had previously blessed the boarding house with official approval, this investigation would be conducted by outsiders with no financial or social connections to Herman's power structure. The state investigators arrived at 1247 Elm Street on October 17, 1864, accompanied by St. Louis physicians and representatives from Missouri's Child Welfare Bureau. What they discovered exceeded even Henry Walsh's disturbing reporting. The basement punishment room contained evidence of torture devices and restraints that would have been shocking in an adult prison, much less a facility supposedly dedicated to child welfare. Medical examinations of the surviving children revealed injuries and malnutrition that documented systematic abuse over extended periods. Mrs. Blackwood's attempt to maintain her facade of charitable work crumbled within hours of the state team's arrival, faced with evidence that could not be explained away or attributed to troubled children's ingratitude. She abandoned the pretense of cooperation and barricaded herself in her private study while investigators catalogued the horrors her operation had inflicted on vulnerable children. The financial records discovered in Mrs. Blackwood's hidden ledger provided devastating evidence of the criminal enterprise that had operated behind the boarding house's charitable facade. State accountants calculated that she had generated over $3,000 in profit from child labor during the boarding house's 10-month operation, an enormous sum that represented the systematic exploitation of every child who had passed through her doors. Judge Hartwell, Dr. Morrison, and Reverend Fitzhugh were arrested on charges of criminal conspiracy and child endangerment. Their attempts to claim ignorance of Mrs. Blackwood's methods were contradicted by her meticulous records, which documented payments and communications that proved their knowing participation in covering up evidence of abuse. The judge's legal authority, the doctor's medical credentials, and the reverend's moral leadership all had been perverted into tools for enabling systematic child exploitation. The surviving children, numbering only 14 of the 43 who had entered the boarding house over the previous year, were removed to legitimate charitable institutions in St. Louis, where they began the long process of physical and psychological recovery. Many would never fully heal from their experiences at 1247 Elm Street, carrying scars both visible and invisible for the remainder of their lives. Mrs. Blackwood herself was found dead in her locked study on October 19, 1864, apparently from poison she had self-administered when she realized that her carefully constructed empire was collapsing. Her suicide prevented a trial that might have revealed all details about her operation and the broader network of child exploitation that investigators suspected extended beyond Herman's borders. The boarding house at 1247 Elm Street was burned to the ground by state order, but the questions it raised about community complicity and systematic child abuse would haunt Missouri for decades to come. Do you think Mrs. Blackwood's suicide was an act of cowardice to avoid justice, or a final attempt to protect others who had participated in her criminal enterprise? The ruins of 1247 Elm Street stood as a blackened reminder of institutional failure and moral cowardice for nearly 2 decades after the boarding house burned to the ground. Herman's citizens, forced to confront the reality of what they had enabled through willful blindness and economic self-interest, struggled with a collective guilt that would define their community's character for generations. The empty lot where Mrs. Blackwood's House of Horrors once stood became an unofficial memorial to the children who had died there, though no official marker ever acknowledged their suffering. The broader implications of the Elm Street scandal extended far beyond Herman's city limits, forcing Missouri lawmakers to confront systematic weaknesses in child welfare oversight that had enabled Mrs. Blackwood's operation to flourish. The state legislature passed comprehensive reforms in 1865 that established regular, unannounced inspections of charitable institutions, required detailed financial reporting for organizations serving children, and created criminal penalties for officials who failed to investigate allegations of abuse. The surviving children faced a lifetime of psychological and physical recovery from their experiences at the boarding house. Mary O'Brien, the courageous girl who had led the Tea Party revelation, never fully recovered from the trauma of her experience, and died in a St. Louis asylum in 1871, her mind broken by memories that no child should have been forced to endure. Lucy Patterson, the youngest survivor, eventually married and raised a family, but she never spoke publicly about her months at 1247 Elm Street, carrying those horrors as private scars that shaped every aspect of her adult life. The community leaders who had enabled Mrs. Blackwood's operation faced varying degrees of justice and social ostracism. Judge Hartwell was stripped of his judicial position and spent 3 years in state prison, his legal career destroyed by revelations of his complicity in systematic child abuse. Dr. Morrison lost his medical license and left Herman in disgrace, his betrayal of the Hippocratic Oath making him unemployable in any respectable medical practice. Reverend Fitzhugh was defrocked by the Methodist Church and spent his remaining years as a bitter, broken man whose moral authority had been permanently destroyed. The Elm Street scandal became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked institutional power and community complicity in systematic abuse. Historians would later identify it as a critical moment in Missouri's social development, when the state was forced to confront the gap between its Christian ideals and its willingness to tolerate exploitation of society's most vulnerable members. Perhaps most tragically, investigators' suspicions that Mrs. Blackwood's operation was part of a broader network of child exploitation proved correct. Similar boarding houses were discovered in Kansas, Illinois, and Arkansas, suggesting that the horrors of 1247 Elm Street were part of a regional system of human trafficking that had operated with minimal oversight during the chaos of the Civil War era. The children who died at Mrs. Blackwood's boarding house were finally laid to rest in marked graves in Herman Cemetery in 1884, 20 years after their deaths. The simple marker reads, "In memory of the innocents who suffered so others might profit, may their souls find the peace that was denied them in life." Tell me in the comments, do you think tragedies like the Elm Street boarding house could happen in modern society, or have our systems of oversight and protection evolved enough to prevent such systematic abuse?